speaker again, but the substantive introduction is something you've already heard from Dr. Dooley. But I will give you a few of the facts, I guess. So on behalf of, first of all, on behalf of the McGill Center for Research in Religion and his Faculty of Religious Studies, welcome all of you to our conference on Thinking the Sacred with Roger Scruton. And I want to take this opportunity to express special thanks to Dr. James Bryson for his excellent organization of this event. A very remarkably interesting program, and I hope that all of you will be able to stay with us through tomorrow to hear these wonderful papers that we have in store for you. James is a Shirk postdoctoral fellow at the center, and thanks to the beneficence of Her Majesty, will be here with us for 2 years, so we're looking forward to another year. It is now my honor and very great pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Roger Scruton to McGill, also on behalf of the center. Roger Scruton is currently a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall at Oxford, and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Early on in his career, he was a research fellow at Peterhouse, Cambridge, that notoriously liberal place, where he completed a PhD in philosophy in 1972, which formed the basis of his first book, Art of the Imagination, published in 1974. He was lecturer and then professor of aesthetics at Birkbeck College in the University of London, and since 1990 he has been self-employed, jousting as it were at the Academy. Roger Scruton was the founding editor of the well-known quarterly journal of conservative thought, the Salisbury Review, a publication which he oversaw for 18 years. And I count myself as one of the early subscribers to this when I was a graduate student in England in the early 1980s. He, to this day, remains a member of the editorial board of that quarterly. During the 1980s, Dr. Scruton forged links between Czechoslovakia's dissident academics and their counterparts in Western universities. And under the auspices of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, he and other academics visited Prague and Brno in support of an underground higher education network. And they helped to smuggle books in and to organize lectures and seminars, and managed to even to arrange for Czech students to enroll in an external degree in theology at the University of Cambridge. And for these services, as probably most of you know, his services to the Hus Foundation and to the Republic of Letters, Roger Scruton was awarded the Medal of Merit of the Czech Republic, first class, in 1998. Scruton is the author of over 40 books, including works of criticism, political theory, and aesthetics, as well as novels and short stories. I'll just mention a couple of these because there's no way we can hear all 40, but these are ones I picked out, I think, in some senses indicative of the breadth of his interests. The Meaning of Conservatism, published in 1980, a book which I bought when it first came out. A Hegelian Defense of Tory Values in the Face of Their Betrayal by Free Marketeers. The argument in this book is interesting. It's that real freedom is not in conflict with obedience. This is reminiscent of the idea that is conveyed in the Book of Common Prayer, that service is perfect freedom. He's written books on the aesthetics of architecture, the aesthetics of music, as we've heard, a number of books looking philosophically at sex. And one that stands out for me is The Death-Devoted Heart, Sex and the Sacred in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. I'm also was very interested to read recently his book, Our Church, A Personal History of the Church of England. And his Gifford lectures, delivered at St. Andrews University in 2010, were published under the title The Face of God. And in his most recent book, published in fact this year, The Soul of the World, he defends the experience of the sacred against today's fashionable forms of atheism, which we've already heard about to some extent from Dr. Dooley. I should also mention that Roger Scruton is the author of operatic libretti, 2 of which have been set to music, which he set to music, a chamber opera titled The Minister from 1994, selections of which will be sung at the Faculty of Music tomorrow, so I hope you'll be able to come to that, and a 2-act opera titled Violet, based on the life of the British harpsichordist Violet Gordon Woodhouse. Roger Scruton is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a Fellow of the European Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a Fellow of the British Academy. He lives with his wife and 2 children in Malmesbury, England. And he will address us now on the experience of the sacred as Lebenswelt. Please welcome Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much for that. This is being recorded, this talk, which is why this microphone is here. But I shall try and project my own voice, and if you don't hear me, just indicate, and I'll speak a bit louder. Thank you to James Bryson for having organised this conference, which of course is immensely flattering to me, not to say embarrassing. And thank you of course to Mark Dooley for everything he said by way of conscripting me to the Roman Catholic cause. I have to say that he still has some way to go in finally achieving the conversion he's aiming at. But maybe I shall succeed in converting him first to a wider vision of Scrutopia. Obviously, I made a mistake in my written work in referring to the idea of the sacred, which was always, as it was something that came to me en passant as perhaps explaining why I was saying the things that I was saying, rather than being the full subject matter of what I was saying. But of course, people have picked it up, Mark in particular, and made it into the subject matter of what I'm saying. And this conference is going to make the thing even worse for me. I shall be now henceforth known as somebody who is propagating a vision of the sacred in a desacralized world. If you don't hear anything more from me after this conference, you understand why. But today, I want to talk about, I have here a PowerPoint presentation, because that will help me to put the discussion on a slightly different level, which is more analytical and more philosophical. And I want to give what I call a transcendental argument for the transcendental. Lisa, no.
My apologies. I don't know this operating system well enough to find where the screen deactivation is. You know how that flips out after a minute? Where do I get it?
Right.
If you know, please. Yeah, please.
I could. I don't have to have the PowerPoint at all.
I think if you go to personalize, you can turn off the screensaver.
Down at the bottom.
Yeah. Personalization at the bottom.
Well, you know, it might be just as well if I read the thing and pretend that I was improvising.
Just turn it off. Can you turn it off?
Yes. That's all right, don't worry. So I had tried to express the point in a few sentences on the screen and then talk around them, but that hasn't happened. So I'll read my text and perhaps improvise a little bit from it. In the work that I've produced, especially recently, The Face of God and the Soul of the World, and the novel Notes from Underground, I've tried to bring together the themes of aesthetic judgment and the religious frame of mind. These have interested me as a phenomena for which a philosophical account is needed. And my treatment of these many issues subsumes them under a single theory of cognitive dualism. And I will explain a bit what that means. I think other people in the conference will also explain it. And I think this theory naturally provokes a sceptical response from informed philosophical readers who would think that I'm giving too much credit to a set of metaphors and treating a mere hope for the transcendental as an actual proof of it. So to address that straight on, I want to give a transcendental argument for the view that we need transcendental categories, since without them our world is not merely impoverished, but lacks features essential to our understanding of ourselves. So from this we can deduce that those categories have as much objectivity as philosophy can bestow on them. However, my way of justifying transcendental categories is somewhat heretical. It makes no claims about any transcendental objects to which they might refer, and I suggest rather that these categories are woven into the way the world appears. That's why I invoke the Lebenswelt as fundamental to the conception of the sacred that I develop. I take the task of philosophy in our time to be one of restoring or saving the appearances, not because there is some reality that threatens to demote or undermine them, but because they are the reality. I think appearances deserve to be taken much more seriously than they are taken, and I agree with the remark of Oscar Wilde that it's a very shallow person who does not judge by appearances. So by transcendental categories, I mean concepts like those of the sacred, the holy, the redemptive, and the transcendental itself, which can't be fully explained in empirical terms, but which seem always to point beyond the limits of our world. We reach for these categories when we're trying to make sense of the irreplaceable value of the things and the people that we love. They dominate our discussion of art and music, and they are invoked obviously at every point in the liturgy of religions. And they seem to feed upon our core experience as persons, the experience of being self-knowing centres of consciousness who relate to each other, I to you, and you to I, you to me. The questions that interest me, therefore, are two: whether we must use those categories in order to make sense of our world, and if so, what do they tell us about that world? We human beings make sense of our experience in many ways, of course, but there are two which stand out as fundamental: the way of explanation and the way of justification. These correspond to two distinct applications of the question, why? The way of explanation, which we know from science, looks for causes and theories, shows how one event can be predicted from another, and how the laws of nature unfold before us in a continuously changing tapestry. The way of justification looks for reasons for which to hold each other to account for what we are and what we do and what we feel. It provides reasons for action and feeling about which our opinions can converge and through which we can find endorsement in the actions and feelings of our fellows. So it shows how to make sense of our world as a shared home. So in recent writings, I try to show that the human world, that the Lebenswelt, as Husserl calls it, is ordered through concepts and conceptions that vanish from the scientific description of nature. This is not an unfamiliar thesis. Wilfrid Sellars expressed it in other terms, didn't take it far enough in my view, but even people like John McDowell and so on, Richard Randall, have developed a kind of version of this. But it isn't, in both those cases, not a version that reaches as far as I want to reach, or could reach that far. Like secondary qualities, such properties as purity, innocence, tragedy, comedy, elegance and refinement are not mentioned in the Book of Science. They describe how the world appears to us, and they identify the occasions of action, but they drop out of every scientific theory, including the theories that explain our belief in them. Evolutionary psychology, for example, is such a theory. It purports to show that the belief in a distinction between the pure and the impure, the sacred and the profane, and so on, are adaptations which serve the reproductive strategies of our genes. Given this, a hard-nosed empiricist will say that, like secondary qualities, those qualities on which our human relations and religious sentiments and aesthetic experiences all depend, are not part of the natural order. We read them into the world. They're part of how the world appears to us, but not part of how it truly is. They stem, as Hume put it, from the mind's capacity to spread itself upon objects, but they have no objective basis. The case is no different from the case of aspects, like the face in the picture, which is there for us in the pigments, but not really there in the way that the pigments are. Now that response is fine so far as it goes, but it is imbued with metaphors. The metaphor that the mind spreads itself on things, that we read things into the world, and so on. It's through and through saturated with the image of a world that we know objectively through science, but colour subjectively by projecting features of our point of view. But it contains no independent argument for thinking that the scientific image, as Sellers dubbed it, is an image of all that there is. Now, the most interesting version of that response, historically speaking, was given by Feuerbach in his materialist response to Hegel. Feuerbach's philosophy of religion is an attempt to undermine the intentionality of our religious thoughts. These thoughts seem to be about God, Christ, the Virgin Mary, and so on. He was talking about Christianity, of course. But those divine persons, Feuerbach argued, are merely projections of the true subject matter of religion, which is man himself in his species being. Religious thoughts, which seem to be about God, are really about man. And by projecting our species being in this way outside ourselves, we are alienating our nature, separating from ourselves, bestowing it on the fictions that suck our lifeblood and deprive us of our moral strength. So Feuerbach set this idea in the context of a materialist theory of mind and an anthropology of fetishism that was to prove immensely influential over the writings of Marx and the Marxists. He also inspired Wagner, who attempted to restore the gods to their human context and to show them to be exactly what Feuerbach had postulated, namely projections on the screen of Valhalla of the passions that burn here below. And in a manner that has never been emulated, Wagner used that idea to illustrate fundamental and universal truths about love, power, and domination. By treating the gods as projections of our human passions, through which we mortals try to fathom the vast impulses that govern us, Wagner understood the gods for the first time. All subsequent anthropology of religion, in my view, has been footnotes to the ring. In the soul of the world, I distance myself from evolutionary explanations of our psychological repertoire, on the grounds that they will always fall short of explaining the intentionality of our mental states. Nevertheless, it is important, worth pointing out that an evolutionary psychologist would dismiss Feuerbach's theory of religion as a non-starter, since it has the implication that religious thoughts and experiences are maladaptive. If we were really alienating ourselves from our species being through thinking religiously, the religious humans would long ago have been replaced by the vigorous materialists, for whom life and virtue are things of this world. But religion is an enduring universal, which has been expelled from human minds only here and there by the costly energies of eccentric elites, the fact suggesting that religion is adaptive after all. But that thought suggests another. There may be benefits from the religious way of thinking that are accessible to philosophical reflection and which do something to justify the thoughts that confer them. That's my contention in this paper, and I build my account on two foundations. First, the theory of cognitive dualism that I advance in The Soul of the World, and secondly, the Kantian method of transcendental argument. These are shaky foundations, but that doesn't distinguish them from any other philosophical foundations. So there are as many ways of conceptualizing our world as there are uses for our classifications, of course. But one particular way of conceptualizing the world has a special claim over our cognitive powers. This is the way presupposed in interpersonal understanding, in which the I concept plays a central role. In The Soul of the World, I take seriously the suggestion that there is an interpersonal conceptual scheme, that this scheme is indispensable to us, that it is incommensurable with the language of science, and that it is in some way comprehensive, giving a complete account of at least some of the objects to which it is applied. This is how I summarize the point. Central to interpersonal dialogue is the practice of accountability. We hold each other to account, not only for our actions, but also for our thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. The question why, addressed from me to you, is not as a rule asking for an explanation, and certainly not for the kind of explanation that a neurologist might give. It is asking for an account of how things are from your first-person perspective that will render you intelligible and, in the normal case, acceptable to me. Sometimes you might be able to offer a justification for your actions and feelings. At other times, your account of them will fall short of justifying them, but nevertheless acknowledge your accountability. Think of dialogue in which the first move is, are you angry with me? So vivid and central in our lives is the I-to-you encounter that we are naturally tempted to believe that it is an encounter between objects, and that these objects exist in some other dimension than that containing ordinary physical things. It is this, I believe, rather than the mysteries of the inner life, that prompt people to espouse some kind of ontological dualism, and to believe that the human being is not one thing, but two. I have suggested rather that there is a cognitive dualism, but not an ontological dualism, underlying our response to the human world. The I-to-you encounter is precisely not an encounter between objects, and therefore not an encounter between objects of a special and ontologically primitive kind. It is an encounter between subjects, and one that can be understood only if we recognize that the logic of first-person awareness is built into the concepts through which our mutual dealings are shaped. Now, much has to be added to that picture if I am to show that the conceptual scheme governing our interpersonal dialogue contains a complete account of our nature, that is to say, as persons, rather than as human organisms. But one purpose of the Soul of the World was to make the first moves in that direction. I should say it's on sale downstairs, so you'll know what I really mean later. And to show the many ways in which our understanding of each other and of the Lebenswelt that contains us is based at every point on first-person accountability, and therefore on the peculiar privileges of self-awareness. The I-to-you encounter lies at the heart of moral reasoning, and this encounter transfigures the world of those who enter it. The primary application of moral thought is not in resolving the dilemmas and quandaries of the all-benevolent reformer, but in sorting things out between you and me. Derek Parfit has made a powerful case for objective reasons for action, rooted in principles that tell us when an action is wrong. But, as Stephen Darwell has argued, moral reasons are also, by their nature, reasons through which we hold each other to account, and the primary forms of wrongdoing are actions by which a person is wronged. Such is the foundation of the calculus of rights and duties that I hold to be central to the life of persons. And I try to show that we experience not only human society, but also the Lebenswelt as a whole, in terms that owe their sense and application to the accountability of persons to each other. Many of these terms are associated with the categories of the sacred, the transcendental, the redemptive, the wholly innocent, and the wholly pure. So it's here that my argument confronts the ghost of Feuerbach. I grant, he will say, that we humans are disposed by nature to project our longings into the sphere of the supernatural. Our first-person being, which situates us on the edge of the natural world, tempts us to suppose the existence of other such beings, who face us from the beyond with some simulacrum of our own emotions. But consciousness is a material process which occurs in a body, and bodies belong to the natural order. All ideas of the supernatural are merely fetishisms, ways of animating the material reality with the ghost of our own intentions. Every attempt to provide a real content to our thoughts must lead us to the material process or material object that gives rise to them. If it does not do so, then this is merely a proof that we are dealing with fictions, imaginary objects, and processes with no role in the world order. A modern scientific realist would add that the world order is the order of nature, that nature simply is what scientific investigation describes, and that the idea of a supernatural realm is not merely unjustified, but in a deep sense incoherent, since it involves both applying and withholding the concepts through which we explain our experience. Such a scientific realist will say that since supernatural objects lie outside the causal order, no event in the natural world can provide evidence for their existence. The very description of them as supernatural situates them in the realm of fictions. Hence, no number of sightings of the Virgin Mary will provide an answer to Feuerbach. But there is another way of answering him, which is to construct a transcendental argument for the use of transcendental concepts. Kant's transcendental deduction, as I understand it, proceeds in the following way. I'm giving a very condensed and almost caricature version of an argument so difficult and complex that nobody has ever claimed to understand it anyway, so it shouldn't matter. So, we are self-conscious beings for whom the I accompanies all our representations. That's Kant's premise. This means that we are aware of an original unity, which he calls the transcendental unity of our perception, according to which my knowledge that this thought, this desire, and this sensation belong to one thing is immediate and criterion-less. I can have this kind of immediate knowledge of my own unity only if I deploy a concept of identity over time, the identity of this thing. And this is possible only if my experience exhibits the order of substance and cause. In short, it is only because I think according to the scientific categories that I can enjoy the self-consciousness that defines the human condition. Hence I can know a priori that my world exhibits the order contained in the categories, and notably that it is a world of substances and causes united under universal laws. Okay, the argument is open to both an objective and a subjective reading. It could be understood as concluding that we must think of the world in a certain way, or as concluding that the world must be a certain way if we are to be conscious of ourselves as part of it. At first sight, those look very different, but only at first sight. For the peculiarity of transcendental arguments is that they confiscate the ground from which their opponents might mount a counter-offensive. If it is really the case that we must think in a certain way in order to enjoy self-consciousness, then the skeptic, whose arguments begin from the assumption of self-consciousness, must also think in that way, so that his attempts to reject our ordinary notions of objectivity will in fact covertly reaffirm them. The transcendental argument precisely transcends the position of the reasoner to say something about the situation that makes reasoning possible, and therefore something about which conclusions he must draw if he is to reason cogently. There is then no logical room left for the supposition that the world might be other than he thinks it to be. There is no point of view from which that thought can be properly spelled out. Now, this is not the point to comment on the validity of Kant's argument, though I have a great respect for it, and I believe that everybody is under a moral obligation to read it at least 10 times. My present concern is to suggest a parallel argument for transcendental categories. Any attempt to deduce from the facts of experience or the incompleteness of science that these categories denote objects and persons in a supernatural world will encounter Feuerbach's objection that we have no criterion for distinguishing a supernatural reality from a fictional projection, and also will encounter Kant's own argument that our concepts cannot reach beyond the realm of phenomena so as to refer successfully to things in themselves. But suppose we sever the concept of the supernatural from any ontological planes and treat the sacred, the supernatural, and the transcendental without supposing that we are thereby referring to specific persons or things, but rather to the ways in which our experience seems to reach always beyond what is given to us. It is then open to us to argue that these concepts are necessary to us in some way, and that even those who mount an argument designed to debunk them will be covertly seeing the world in the terms that they lay down. And that's the suggestion that I put forward in The Soul of the World, and I want to make it explicit. Kant was right to believe that self-consciousness presupposes a world. I exist as a subject, that is a self-conscious being with immediate knowledge of an inner realm, only because I exist in a world of objects that I can identify as other than myself. Reference in turn presupposes other people with whom I share language, and therefore the first-person perspective. And language presupposes a shared world, a Lebenswelt in which others appear as subjects like myself. Good, address me, I to you. We become self-conscious and free agents through our mutual dealings, in which each person attributes authority to the first-person reasons of the other. This process, described in controversial though brilliant terms by Hegel, is spelled out more cautiously in The Soul of the World. It leads me to postulate what I call the overreaching intentionality of interpersonal attitudes. This is what I say about that. In all our responses to each other, whether love or hate, affection or disaffection, approval or disapproval, anger or desire, we look into the other in search of that unattainable horizon from which he or she addresses us. We are animals swimming in the currents of causality who relate to each other in space and time. But in the I-to-you encounter, we do not see each other in that way. Each human object is also a subject, addressing us in looks, gestures and words from the transcendental horizon of the I. Our responses to others aim towards that horizon, passing on beyond the body to the being that it incarnates. It is this feature of our interpersonal responses that gives such compelling force to the myth of the soul, of the true but hidden self that is veiled by the flesh. And because of this, our interpersonal responses develop in a certain way. We see each other as wrapped within those responses, so to speak, and we hold each other to account for them as though they originated ex nihilo from the unified center of the self. You may say that when we see each other in this way, we are giving credence to a metaphysical doctrine, maybe even a metaphysical myth. But it is not Descartes' doctrine of the soul substance, nor is it obviously a myth. Moreover, a doctrine that is enshrined in our basic personal emotions, which cannot be eliminated without undermining the I-you relationship on which our first-person understanding depends, cannot be dismissed as a simple error. It has something of the status that Kant attributes to the original unity of consciousness, the status of a presupposition of our thinking, including the thinking that might lead us to cast doubt on it. Indeed, on one understanding of the matter, the adherence to this presupposition and the practice that flows from it is what Kant's transcendental freedom really amounts to. And that's all around quotation. We have to think of each other in that way if we are to build the world of human relations. But for this very reason, we must deploy transcendental concepts, which reach beyond the natural order if we are to understand the world as it truly is. These concepts come tumbling into our perspective along with the overreaching intentionality with which we address each other. They are not projections onto the human world, but invitations from it. That, briefly, is the lesson I take from aesthetics. When aesthetics came fully into being as a branch of philosophy, it was in the wake of the Enlightenment and with the first stirrings of the Romantic movement in art and literature. Art then came to fill the God-shaped hole in the scheme of things that had been made by science. Our civilization needed a source of meaning after the old source offered by religion had been destroyed. Art offered a new kind of meaning, not transcendental but immanent, a meaning wrapped into the very surface of the material world. Philosophers turned their attention to the beautiful with the same emotional and intellectual hunger that they had once addressed the divine, but without the illusion that they gained knowledge of a transcendental reality. All this is brought explicitly into consciousness in Kant's third critique and in Hegel's lectures on aesthetics. Now, there is truth in that snippet of intellectual history, but it is not the whole truth about aesthetics. Works of art present meaning in sensory form, but the meaning transcends the form, containing intimations of the supernatural. We cannot understand the music of Bach, the painting of Botticelli, or the poetry of Wordsworth if we do not see that these works are about the transcendental and the sacred, and that they address us from a place beyond the horizon of the empirical world. Through exploring the aesthetic experience, therefore, we come to understand the transcendental as a real presence in our lives. The concepts that were once the foundation of the religious worldview gain a new solidity from art. Through the aesthetic experience, we encounter the elusive first-person perspective that shadows us and calls us to account. And that is why art is so consoling and so disturbing. It looks on us with the eye of judgment, but from a place beyond the horizon of our world. But of course, man does not live by art alone, and some people are entirely untouched by it. A transcendental argument needs to show that all rational beings, whatever our beliefs and interests, must deploy concepts of the supernatural if we are to understand our experience. To me, this observation is confirmed by our interpersonal relations, which take off and come to fruition only in those who see them as reaching beyond the natural order in which we are as though imprisoned. Among the many illustrations of the point, sexual desire is surely one of the most eloquent. Hence, in Sexual Desire and Death Devoted Part, I have argued that the object of desire, as this emerges in a society of mutually accountable beings, is the individual person, conceived as another subjective viewpoint on the horizon of my world. That is not how animals conceive their mates, nor is it how every human approaches the object of his sexual interest, alas. For the individualizing intentionality of our sexual emotions is an artifact brought about through elaborate stratagems of mutual dealing, whereby the I is placed at the very center of the narrative, coaxed into the flesh in the moment of arousal and offered to the other as a gift. There is a process here in which I thoughts and mutual accountability govern all that passes between lovers. Sexual behavior and the intentionality of the feelings on which it depends are malleable and can change direction as a result of cultural and other influences. The change of focus of sexual interest from subject to object, from the other person to his body parts, a change of focus already implied in the Kinsey reports and in the orgasm-obsessed writings of Wilhelm Reich, has led to a new kind of sexual interest, marketed around the globe in the form of pornography and effectively destroying for many young people the experience of sexual love. The temptation was always there, as I point out, and this is a quotation again. The tree of knowledge that caused the fall of man is surely wrongly described as giving us the knowledge of good and evil. Rather, it gave us the knowledge of ourselves as objects. We fell from the realm of subjectivity into the world of things. We learned to look on each other as objects and to sweep away the face and all that the face stands for. We lost what was most precious to us, which is the untorn veil of the Lebenswelt, stretching from horizon to horizon across the dark matter from which all things, we included, are composed. So, end of the quote. It is surely evident that the person who, in the sexual act, approaches the other as an assemblage of body parts or as an instrument of pleasure replaceable by any number of functionally equivalent alternatives is missing something. That missing thing is the interpersonal relationship, which cannot be built in this way. If you see desire in the terms that have become fashionable as the pursuit of pleasurable sensations in the private parts, then the sphere of sexual relations becomes entirely demoralized. The outrage and pollution of rape, for example, then become impossible to explain. Rape, on this view, is every bit as bad as being spat upon, but no worse. In fact, just about everything in human sexual behavior becomes unintelligible, and this is the condition that we are fast approaching, in which people no longer know what they are doing when they make or give way to sexual advances. Our world is now full of people, women especially, seeking revenge for sexual affronts that they never anticipated, since they lacked the concepts that would have enabled them to envisage before it happened the shame and humiliation of an unwanted moment of arousal. The overreaching intentionality that ought to be at the center of our sexual emotions makes highly specific demands on us. It requires us to acknowledge the a priori innocence of children. It requires us to distinguish pure and impure, clean and dirty, the sacred and the desecrated. It elicits reluctance and hesitation, including the strange shame of the body that is described by Platone, Plato's sister, in one of my scientific dialogues. All those ways of thinking, which are embedded in the idea of the supernatural, come into play in our sexual encounters and are often dramatized there. Through them we understand what is forbidden to us and what we may decently pursue. They isolate the other in the way that saints and divinities are isolated in their shrines, set aside and forbidden, as Durkheim put it. They transform sexual desire from an impulse to a life project. Of course, such states of mind overreach themselves, and their transcendental intentionality does not cancel their mortal imperfection. Incarnate beings cannot live up to their immortal longings. And if they do not try to do so, however, they fall short of what they are, and the loss shows itself in a kind of enslavement as bodily appetite takes over from spiritual longing. So, in Sexual Desire, which was published in 1986, before the whole worldwide contagion of pornography existed. So, in Sexual Desire, I argue that the normal course of sexual conduct leads us to understand the object of desire in that individualizing and personal way. It is therefore inevitable that our emotions towards the object of desire will lead us to see him or her in terms that have a transcendental meaning. If we purge sexual experience of all ideas of innocence, pollution, guilt, shame, desecration, and the sanctity of the other, then we arrive precisely at the situation paraded each day before the American law courts, in which bewildered victims of their own cognitive dysfunction seek revenge for they know not what. If that is true, then we have the basis for an interesting transcendental argument. The self-conscious experience of sex as a going out towards the other presupposes transcendental categories, the sacred, the redemptive, the innocent, the pure, the polluted, and so on. It is not enough to think about sexual relations merely in contractual terms, as though the only relevant question from the moral perspective is the question of consent. For offences against innocence, purity, and sanctity can be as well inflicted by consent as by coercion. To describe these wrongs, we must make use of transcendental categories. I don't mean that we apply those categories to items that are not of this world or in this world. We apply them to each other, on the understanding that only in this way do we capture the distinctive focus of our emotions, which reach out towards the edge of things. Nevertheless, transcendental categories do point to the very edge of nature and contain a kind of intimation of the beyond. They are not projections in Feuerbach's sense, since they do not commit us to any belief in a realm of transcendental beings, but like the eye concept, they shine a light towards the horizon, and their sense resides in this. Moreover, if we do not use these concepts, or other concepts from the same family, our sexual encounters will suffer the fall that I described above. We will relate to each other as objects, not subjects, and to that extent fail to relate. Our growth as self-conscious subjects will be truncated or distorted, as we see so often today. Moreover, when this fall occurs, it does not really occur. The objectifying view of the other is no more really available or sustainable than is skepticism available or sustainable to the user of the categories. If Kant is right, then the skeptic's attempt to state his position will always require him to use the concepts that subvert it. Likewise, the attempt to experience sexual relations in purely objective terms will always subvert itself, leaving a confused residue of interpersonal feeling, the expense of spirit in a waste of shame, as Shakespeare famously put it. The shame here being precisely a reaching out to those ideas of the sacred and the transcendental that demand recognition when one person stands accountable before another. This confused invocation of the transcendental is surely what we are now seeing in the young women who struggle to understand how they have been wronged by the man to whom they yielded, and who describe what seemed at the time like a consensual transaction, in retrospect, as domination, abuse, or even date rape. Sure, the parallel with Kant's transcendental deduction is not exact. It would be possible to live in another way, as though sex were not a form of personal relation. So far, human beings have not succeeded in this, though in Brave New World, Huxley tries to suggest that they might. And our world is certainly moving in that direction. Still, the argument suggests that the idea of the sacred may not, after all, be vulnerable to Feuerbach's debunking of it. It may have an indispensable cognitive role, not in leading us towards transcendental objects, but in showing us the metaphysical horizon of our world. Moreover, Feuerbach is precisely wrong in thinking that the popular belief in gods, saints, and holy persons involves an alienation of the human essence. On the contrary, it is through these beliefs that people down the centuries have been able to acknowledge the human essence, to continue to see each other as free subjectivities in all the encounters of everyday life, and to attribute to those whom they love the sacred and redemptive character that makes love something more than a need of the body. The belief in gods, saints and holy persons provides a frame within which the human possibilities are displayed. We strive to fill that frame and demand that others fill it also. Take the frame away, deprive people of the transcendental intentionality of their loves and judgments, and it is precisely then that they are alienated from the human essence, no longer certain that the life of the accountable person is worth leading, or that others are really anything more than self-deluded animals. Kant attempted to underpin the scientific worldview by showing that all self-conscious creatures have to bring their experience under the categories of scientific explanation, and therefore to accept the scientific image. My argument aims to show that all persons, in other words, all who can relate to others by situating them in a shared Lebenswelt, have to bring their experience under transcendental concepts, and therefore to see the world as a revelation of an ineffable beyond. They do not have to theorize this revelation in terms of any specific religion or metaphysic, any more than they have to spell out the scientific image in terms of some particular physical theory. The revelation lies incipient in their interpersonal dealings and governs their conduct and decision-making in ways that profoundly affect what they are for each other and for themselves. Of course, skeptics will deny that they use concepts of the transcendental, just as Hume denied that he meant by cause what Kant argued that he must mean if he was to think coherently. The labour of philosophy, in my view, is to show the way in which concepts of the transcendental are embedded in the worldview of those who claim to reject them, surfacing not merely in interpersonal attitudes like praise, blame and love, but also in what I should call the experience of apartness. Religious people live with the awareness that they are exiles in this world, that their home is elsewhere, and that their passage through life is a pilgrimage. They are in the empirical world, but not of it. Many people claim not to understand this apartness, but its reality is abundantly proved by art. The ineffable meaning in a work of music, the voice that inhabits another space and which calls to us from regions that we can never enter, reminds us that our most intense experiences do not link us to the empirical world, but lift us out of it. Architecture too reminds us of this. The discipline of architecture, I have argued, is not a discipline of the eye only, but a discipline of the soul. It is an attempt to create the city as a sacred place and to relay the real presence of the unseen observer in the smallest details of a shed or a wall. We are home-building creatures only because our home is not really here. Our religious experience is often encapsulated in stories which tell the tale of exemplary human beings and of the gods and angels who guide them. Those stories are stories of redemption. They contain deep truths about the human condition and about what we must do in order to find sense in our mortality. God enters the stories through the prayers and beliefs of the human beings whose stories they are. In himself, he remains transcendental, not part of the world of cause and effect, and inaccessible to scientific inquiry. The temptation is to say, therefore, that the transcendental is simply ineffable, and that while our concepts point beyond the world of nature, they cannot reach beyond it. Such, indeed, is the message of Kant's first critique. To call something ineffable, however, is not to dismiss it as unreal. Every inquiry into first principles, original causes, and fundamental laws will at some stage come up against an unanswerable question. What makes those first principles true, or those fundamental laws valid? What explains those original causes or initial conditions, the singularity of the Big Bang, and so on? And the answer is that there is no answer, or no answer that can be expressed in terms of the science for which those laws, principles, and causes are bedrock. The question supposes an answer, but the answer is ineffable. The ineffable, in other words, is sometimes real, and indeed the ultimate reality. In reflecting on this puzzle, the aesthetic again provides a measure of guidance. Something can be meaningful, even though its meaning eludes all attempts to put it into words. Fauré's F-sharp ballade, for instance, the smile on the face of the Mona Lisa, the evening sunlight on the hill behind my house. Wordsworth would describe our experience of such things as intimations, which is fair enough, provided you don't add, as he did, further and better particulars. Anybody who goes through life with open mind and open heart will encounter these moments of revelation. moments that are saturated with meaning, but whose meaning cannot be put into words. These moments are precious to us. When they occur, it is as though on the winding, ill-lit stairway of our life, we suddenly come across a window through which we catch sight of another and brighter world, a world to which we belong, but which we cannot enter. Like my philosophical predecessors, I want to describe that world beyond the window, even though it cannot be described, but only revealed. I am not alone in thinking that world to be real and important. There are many who, like Feuerbach, dismiss it as an illusion, but there is an aspect of the human condition that is denied to such people. Moreover, this aspect is of the first importance. Our loves and hopes in some way hinge on it. We love each other as angels love, reaching for the unknowable eye. We hope as angels hope, with our thoughts fixed on the moment when the things of this world fall away and we are enfolded in the peace which passes understanding. Putting the point that way, I've already said too much, for my words make it look as though the world beyond the window is actually here, like a picture on the stairs. But it is not here, it is there, beyond the window that can never be opened, and before which we cannot linger, for we are prisoners of time, and our steps trudge always onwards and up. Paying due respect to what I earlier said about the cognitive value of our ideas of the transcendental, we can surely conclude that the religious sensibility is not as empty a thing as Feuerbach and his modern followers suppose. Armed with the concept of the sacred that is a necessary part of our interpersonal understanding, and an idea of the ineffable that is nurtured on aesthetic experience, we can listen to the deeper meaning of our religious stories and hear what they tell us about the sacrificial sense of our lives. Not only is that better than nothing, nothing in all its many forms is the only alternative on offer.
Thank you so much. Would you entertain questions?
Yes, I'm open to questions. Fiona Ellis, I knew you would straight away persecuting me.
So I'd just like to ask you to clarify your concept of ontology. So there are two ways in which you're using this one, and I think you move from one to the other in a potentially quite important way. For some of the time, I think you're saying that we've got to sever the self from God through ontology, meaning by that you can't say that these things exist. And I think that that's what you mean when you say you've got to talk in non-ontological terms, much more. But also, you seem to be working with the conception of ontology that someone like Levinas is working with. So ontology, by definition, cannot accommodate value or value-involving concepts. But to say that the cell has to be severed from ontology doesn't imply that it doesn't exist or that you can't say that it exists. And for a lot of the time, you seem to be working with that conception of ontology. I just wonder whether you could clarify it for me?
No. I suppose I've always found, I have to say, the tradition to which Levinas belongs more difficult to understand than mine. So I've never felt the temptation to translate my thoughts into Lebanese. But I'm aware of the fact that phenomenologists, especially of his kind, do use a concept of ontology which is rather different from mine. I was really trying to say that, very simply, that we don't quantify over the transcendental. Put it in those old-fashioned analytical terms, but it doesn't follow from that we don't think in terms of the transcendental, just as we don't quantify over fictions, but we think in terms of them. And there are all kinds of ways in which, in my view, we can build up a picture of the world which makes room for this way of looking at things without committing us explicitly to any particular account of what our world contains, other than what is there in the appearance of things.
So just one more thing. Do you think that you quantify over human beings?
Over human beings? Yes, of course. We are individuals in the empirical world, But we are a paradigm case of things that can be seen in two ways, in the two ways that I'm trying to advocate. But we are obviously animal organisms that belong to a certain species and that can be understood in that way. And this is what Kant pursued so beautifully, and that we are also, for each other, something quite different. And we apply to each other concepts like that of the transcendental freedom, which have no place in the scientific worldview. But nevertheless, those concepts are fundamentally necessary to us. And a concept that is necessary for understanding what you are and the world in which you're situated is not one that you can then simply dismiss. That was the thought that I was putting across. Yes?
Can I just ask a kind of interpretive question about how the vision of Scrutopia that you've just presented relates to the vision of Scrutopia that we had earlier from Mark? I suppose, if I remember rightly, Mark talked in terms of how the subjectivity of the world is God itself. How in a secret place, personality shines from mere objects. So your focus has obviously been upon the interpersonal, interhuman encounter, when the sacred arises out of that kind of encounter. But are you also committed to the thought that the world in general, or paranormal things in the world, are also sites potentially for this kind of encounter which leads to the
yes, that's the theme of my book, The Soul of the World, where I try to explore all the different areas in which, where Feuerbach would say we're projecting our human intentions on or animating, or fetishizing rather, the world in terms of our human states of mind, where are in fact bringing it under concepts which might be necessary to understand it. And that I take the example of architecture and the idea of the sacred place in which you embellish through building it in it and through summoning the whole meaning of your community into the presence of it. I take that as very fundamental to our understanding of the world as a home and a place in which we are situated. And I think that's what the environmental movement is really trying to recapture. That sense that the world is not simply a thing described by geological science. But, and of course, I don't want to go to extreme form of the Gaia hypothesis and all that, but nevertheless, I see this need to apply these transcendental concepts more widely than the interpersonal world as fundamental. John, not next.
Thank you very much. In your answer to Freud, and the essence of your answer to Freud, as I understand, is that these things are not just projection, rather they're indispensable categories in terms of which we express certain human belongings. And that seems to work, potentially to work quite well in the case of human relationships, or even the architectural and musical cases you discovered. Not at all clear how it meets that main target, which is God, which is God. That didn't figure in any of yours, right?
Well, true, but then that's what I came back around to at the end. If my argument is right, of course, I've given a justification of transcendental categories which deprives them of that last little stage of reference towards divinities. I want to say that we understand these without making that final jump towards peopling, populating the heavens with these beings. It doesn't follow that we can't do that, or that we haven't laid grounds for that. And I want to say, of course, we're in the realm of the ineffable or the revealed, and it could be that, and my mind doesn't stretch this far, but it could be that you could develop not necessarily an argument, but a way of understanding these transcendental categories, which gave to those beings all the reality in people's sentiments that they need. I, however, remain on the threshold of that, where works of art do something similar, filling that huge space, huge but ineffable space, which I know is where I belong.
Just following upon that, I wonder if I might ask, certainly my privilege as chair, I was very struck by your metaphor of the veil of the Lebenswelt, stretching from one end to another. Were you deliberately evoking Wisdom 8?
No, but
in
maybe Wisdom 8 was deliberately invoking
the Wisdom of Solomon is about how wisdom stretches from one end to another, ordering all things sweetly, suaviter, and devoted. And it seemed, it just occurred to me as I was listening to that metaphor that there might be some sense in which Lebenswelt is a surrogate for a divine wisdom. Is that too much wisdom?
Well, I think, yes, it is very, that is taking that step that John Cottingham is trying to compel me to take. And I'm refusing at this stage of the conference.
But maybe your own imagination is taking you there.
Yeah, sure. I realise that I've been led by something in me that I have tried to suppress. Yeah. Otherwise, life would have been much more boring. Chuck Taylor, it's very nice to see you here.
Yes, it's nice to see you. I really enjoyed it. I'm rushing by the book.
Right.
But I wanted to look at it from another point of view. Take Feuerbach. You could see him as making a move, surely, what there aren't these things, there are only these things done. Or you could see him as making another kind of move, which is to say, I can see a path of transformation whereby you will become much greater and fuller and much more what you are if you disalienate these qualities from that. So it's not, in other words, it could be seen not as a proto-Dawkins
Yeah.
but as a like ethical claim,
Yeah.
In which it fails very, very clearly, but it fails in a quite different way. So, and that is, and I think that in your general category of the way of justification of something, it points to something like making sense of our work. And this is a way in which we will try to make sense. That if you undergo this transition, take this, then you will become another kind of person, and then everything will be either clearer or better or you or whatever. So very many things are made in the religious view.
Yes. Well, I think you're right. I think probably Wagner's understanding of Feuerbachian vision is more the one that you're putting across. And Wagner thought, he conceived the ring as a way, as a drama of the gods, which would make even clearer the inner drama of man, but always recognize that the descent from the world of gods into the world of men was not a moral decline, but a step upwards morally. That it's in our world that the moral proof is offered, including proof of the divine. And that, of course, has very close parallel with the Christian doctrine, that this transcendent value of God is revealed in his descent into our condition. Yes, sir.
I found it very interesting to hear the examples about the loss of the transcendental element in sexual love through the lens of Kant, because Kant solves that problem by reducing acceptable sexual relations effectively to contract. And Hegel picks him up on that because he misses these elements of love and family and community which escape the tiny categories. And I think it's also very interesting that when you focus on aesthetics and art as that thing which can replace the transcendent, and you look at Kant's aesthetics, which is all about waterfalls and the dynamic sublime and things like that. Art is missing from it. So is there a non-Kantian transcendental here at work that is, or do you have to go beyond Kant in order to get at the true meaning of transcendental that you're possible?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and I'm not quite sure how to approach it. Obviously, Kant, to put it mildly, was no expert on sexual desire. And he did famously describe marriage as a contract for the mutual use of the sexual organs, which suggests that he hadn't got a very advanced view of what was involved. And Hegel was obviously not like Kant in that respect, but unusually active erotically for a philosopher. And so, Hegel actually said some very important things about all this, but he didn't use, obviously, the kind of arguments that I've been using. I've been trying to adapt Kant's transcendental deduction of the categories to give a transcendental deduction of the transcendental categories. And it's a bit of a cheat, really. But, Hegel does see human relations very much in terms of the path that leads towards self-consciousness and towards the only kind of freedom that matters, which is the bounded freedom with which we find ourselves when we're locked into fully satisfying relations with others. And the whole project of the phenomenology of spirit is that, especially all the passages about the master and slave and so on. And he would see, of course, that we do develop in this direction, the direction that I've been describing, and that sexual desire is a fundamental part of it. And of course he had a much richer experience of art than Kant had. But it is interesting that Hegel's aesthetics relies at every point on Kant's third critique. When he actually gives his account of what aesthetic judgment is in the preface to the lectures on aesthetics, it is purely the third critique of Kant. And I think that it is one of the great works, it is perhaps the greatest work of aesthetics, even though it's written in such a peculiar way. And Schopenhauer likewise relied in the end entirely on Kant's third critique, just for saying what aesthetic judgment actually is. But to go a stage further and say why it is that works of art feed into our interest in aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment, that is something that Kant did not do, but Hegel did begin to do. And it is, I think, one of the deepest and most difficult questions of philosophy to try and understand why it is that, for instance, a work of music composed purely of sequences of sounds should elicit in us that desire to attend to it for its own sake and find meaning in it. That is an extraordinary matter, and maybe something, perhaps Verdi was going to say something about that tomorrow. Somebody's going to talk about it anyway, I hope.
Just one very quick moment to conclude, but it is true that at the end of sexual desire, in the chapter that I've made reference to earlier, the politics of sex, you do kind of end up with this kind of Hegelian vision, of the sexual relations surrounded by community and endorsed by the institutions, and that they cannot properly function, even at the transcendental level, without those institutions, which hem them in, or which you're surrounded by at every turn, even within the bedroom, where the institution is there. And so therefore, just what I was trying to suggest earlier is that when you use the term sacred there, in that particular context, it does have a kind of Hegelian resonance, even though Hegel never really used that word.
Yes. I think, well, of course, the most famous theory of the sacred in sociology is Durkheim's. That is the expression of the community's will to live in the individual person.
Well, thank you for your lecture and for issuing the challenge. We're going to get a number of responses today and tomorrow. We are embodied preachers and there's tea waiting. So I'd ask you not to waylay our lecture because I think he probably needs tea as much as any of us. So thank you very much.